Welcome back to the study. Listen closely to the room around you. The rhythmic, comforting rain that washed over the battlefields of Middle-earth has ceased. In its place, a sharp, biting wind rattles the frosted glass of our window. The air in the archive has grown terribly cold, and the fire in the hearth struggles to maintain its warmth against the drafts creeping beneath the heavy oak door. We have closed the great golden ledger of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. We have said our goodbyes to the elves, the angelic wizards, and the comforting moral absolutes of the Third Age. We have stepped out of the safety of the myth, and we have crossed the threshold into the brutal, unforgiving winter of historical realism. Tonight, we begin a new expedition. We are going to open a completely different kind of book. One bound not in elven leather and starlight, but in mud, iron, and dried blood. We are entering the world of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. But before we can map the treacherous labyrinth corridors of Red Keep or disciple the Machiavellian physics of Westerosi politics, we must first confront the ghost we left behind. We must surgically sewer the umbilical cord of traditional fantasy. We must deconstruct the most sacred, foundational trope that Tolkien cemented into the cultural consciousness. And we must understand exactly why Martin decided to take a hammer and shatter it into 1,000 pieces. We must talk about the Aragorn tax policy. To understand the magnitude of Martin's rebellion, we must first revisit the triumphant climax of the traditional fantasy narrative. Think back to the final pages of The Return of the King. The Dark Lord has been cast down, the shadow has lifted, and Aragorn, son of Arathorn, is finally crowned as the High King of Gondor and Arnor. In the architectural framework of Tolkien's universe, Aragorn represents the absolute pinnacle of human potential. He is the hidden hero, possessing the blood of ancient Numenor, tested through decades of grueling hardship, unwavering in his loyalty, and possessing a heart of absolute, incorruptible virtue. When he takes the throne, Tolkien wraps up his reign with a beautiful, sweeping mythological summary. We are told that Aragorn ruled wisely and well for over a century. He brought peace to the land. He dispensed justice with a fair hand. The withered white tree burst into bloom, and the realms of men flourished in a new golden age. This ending relies on a deeply ancient mythological concept known in literary circles as the Fisher King trope, or the divine right of kings. In this romantic framework, the physical health of the kingdom is directly, magically tethered to the moral purity of the sovereign. If the king is good, honorable man, the crops will yield bountiful harvests, the rivers will flow clean, the common folk will be happy, and the realm will prosper. Virtue is the only necessary qualification for administration. The narrative implies that because Aragorn is a fundamentally decent human being who fought bravely against cosmic evil, he will automatically possess the logistical, economic, and political genius required to govern a massive, war-torn continent. For decades, this was the unquestioned law of fantasy literature. You find the hidden prince, you put the magical crown on his head, and the story ends. Happily ever after is guaranteed by the sheer, radiant strength of the hero's pure heart. And then, the turn of the millennium. A writer from Bayonne, New Jersey, looked at this beautiful, comforting tapestry and asked a series of deeply uncomfortable, strictly logistical questions. Martin is famously a massive admirer of Tolkien. He considers The Lord of the Rings one of the greatest achievements in literature. But Martin's background was not in philology or ancient myth. His background was in journalism, history, and the gritty, morally compromised reality of human politics. When Martin looked at the crowning of Aragorn, his mind immediately bypassed the romantic poetry and crashed headfirst into the bureaucratic reality of post-war reconstruction. In a now legendary interview, Martin articulated the exact philosophical divergence that birthed A Song of Ice and Fire. He said, "Ruling is hard. This was maybe my answer to Tolkien, whom, as much as I admire him, I do quibble with. Lord of the Rings had a very medieval philosophy, that if the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at the real history, and it's not that simple. Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and ruled for 100 years, and he was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy?" Let those words echo in the cold air of this study. What was Aragorn's tax policy? Martin did not stop there. He continued to aggressively interrogate the myth. Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all these orcs? By the end of the war, Sauron is gone, but all of the orcs aren't gone. They're in the mountains. Did Aragorn pursue a policy of systematic genocide and kill them? Even the little baby orcs in their little orc cradles? This is not a petty critique. It is a profound architectural deconstruction of the entire fantasy genre. Martin is pointing out a devastating historical truth. Ruling a kingdom has absolutely nothing to do with having a pure heart. A crown is not a magical artifact that cures poverty, stabilizes inflation, and magically resolves ethnic tensions. A kingdom runs on grain, on steel, on complex supply chains, on shifting alliances, and on blood money. If a king is a fundamentally good man who refuses to raise taxes because he deeply pities the poor peasantry, how does he pay his soldiers? And if he cannot pay his soldiers, how does he prevent them from rebelling, turning into bandits, and burning the very peasants the king was trying to protect? If he shows absolute, honorable mercy to the treacherous lords who allied with the Dark Lord, does he not project a fatal, irresistible weakness, inviting a second civil war? In the brutal, historical reality that Martin constructs, goodness and administrative competence are not synonymous. In fact, they are very frequently mutually exclusive. To completely shatter the Tolkien trope, Martin gave us his own twisted, tragically realistic version of Aragorn right at the very beginning of A Game of Thrones. He gives us King Robert Baratheon. Look at the backstory of Robert's rebellion. It reads exactly like a classic, heroic fantasy epic. A brave, impossibly strong warrior lord rises up against a mad, evil king. He fights for the honor of his kidnapped love, Lyanna Stark. He meets the Dark Prince, Rhaegar Targaryen, in a single combat at the Ruby Ford of the Trident, and he strikes him down with a mighty warhammer. He wins the war, overthrows the tyrannical dynasty, and ascends the Iron Throne. If this were a traditional fantasy novel, the book would end right there. Robert would rule wisely and well, and the land would prosper. But Martin begins his story 15 years later. He forces us to look at what actually happens when the warrior puts down his warhammer and is forced to pick up a ledger. Robert Baratheon was a great man of war, a fearless leader of men, and a highly charismatic hero. But as a king, he is a catastrophic failure. His bravery on the battlefield translates into reckless negligence in the council chambers. His booming charisma translates into a hedonistic refusal to govern. Because ruling is tedious. Ruling is counting coppers, listening to the endless complaints of petty lords and balancing the demands of the faith against the demands of the merchant. Robert leaves the actual governing to ambitious, calculating men like Peter Baelish and the Lannisters, and in doing so, he bankrupts the crown, plunging the realm 6 million golden dragons into debt. The heroic warrior king inadvertently sets the stage for a continental war that will simply burn the Seven Kingdoms to ash, simply because he was a fighter who fundamentally did not understand tax policy. And then, to drive the final nail into the coffin of the myth, Martin gives us Eddard Stark. Ned Stark is the closest thing Westeros has to a Tolkien character. He is deeply honorable, fiercely loyal, morally unyielding, and fundamentally good. He is the emotional anchor for the reader, the classic hero who seeks out the truth and tries to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. But Martin takes this good man and drops him into the political ecosystem of King's Landing, a predatory environment where honor is not a shield, but a predictable, highly exploitable vulnerability. Ned assumes that the rules of fair play apply. He assumes that warning Queen Cersei so she can flee with her children is an act of noble, righteous mercy. In Tolkien's world, this mercy would have been rewarded by Providence, just as Bilbo Baggins' mercy toward Gollum literally saved the world. In Martin's world, this mercy is a fatal, tactical blunder that gets Ned Stark betrayed, imprisoned, and ultimately beheaded on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor. This is the profound, terrifying paradigm shift of A Song of Ice and Fire. Martin deconstructed the myth of the good king to prove that a pure heart cannot govern a kingdom of vipers. To be an effective ruler in a realistic world requires deceit, compromise, ruthlessness, and willingness to dirty your own hands. The good men in Westeros are either slaughtered because they refuse to adapt, or they are forced to compromise their morality so deeply that they are no longer good men. The throne is not a reward for virtue, it is a meat grinder. The kingdom is not an extension of King's soul, it is a massive, incredibly fragile bureaucratic machine that requires constant, cynical maintenance. As we sit in this freezing study, we must discard our romantic expectations. We are no longer observing a battle between the forces of light and the armies of darkness. We are about to map a world where the heroes make fatal administrative errors, where the villains write the economic policies, and where the most dangerous weapon is not a magical sword forged by elves, but a sealed letter and a quiet whisper in a dark corridor. The trope of the rightful king has been broken, but as we will see later, Martin did not stop at deconstructing the crown. He aimed his scalpel at the very fabric of narrative destiny itself. We must turn the page and examine the absolute, paralyzing shock of the execution block. We must witness the death of plot armor. We established that George Martin fundamentally rejects the Tolkienesque notion that a pure heart equates to a prosperous reign. We established that a good man can be a terrible king, simply because he does not understand the brutal arithmetic of taxation and logistics. But Martin's rebellion against the fantasy genre did not stop at economics and politics. To truly birth a new era of storytelling, he had to destroy something much more profound. He had to reach through the pages of the book, grab the reader by the shoulders, and aggressively shatter the most sacred psychological contract that exists between an author and their audience. He had to execute the main character. He had to murder the concept of plot armor. To understand the absolute seismic shockwave of the execution of Eddard Stark, We must not analyze it merely as a political blunder. We must analyze it as a monumental, unprecedented literary assassination. We must look at how Martin weaponized our own reading habits against us, proving once and for all that in the world of ice and fire, the cold, hard physics of consequence will always crush the romantic illusion of destiny. Since the dawn of modern fantasy, there has been an unspoken, ironclad rule governing the architecture of the narrative. It is the concept of the chosen one, or the hero with a mission from fate. When we open a classic fantasy novel, the author makes a quiet, psychological promise to us. I'll put this protagonist through hell. I will break their bones. I will test their spirit, but I will not kill them before their purpose is fulfilled. In literary terms, this invisible, impenetrable shield is known as plot armor. Think of Frodo Baggins collapsing on the slopes of Mount Doom. Think of Aragorn facing down the endless hordes at the Black Gate. As readers, we feel tension in these scenes, but we do not feel existential terror for their lives. Why? Because we understand the structural geometry of the myth. We knew that the story requires them to survive to achieve the climax. In classic fantasy, the universe itself is fundamentally moral. It possesses a divine providence, what Tolkien called grace. This grace bends the laws of probability to protect the righteous. It sends the eagles at the exact moment of absolute despair. It ensures that the hero's moral purity acts as a magical repellent against permanent death. This creates a comfortable safety net for the reader. We invest our emotional energy into the protagonist because we are guaranteed a return on that investment. We know they are immune to random, meaningless tragedy. George R.R. Martin looked at the safety net, recognized it for the comforting illusion that it was, and decided to cut the ropes. To maximize the devastation of this betrayal, Martin had to set up a trap flawlessly. He had to convince us that a Game of Thrones was playing by the old and established rules of the genre. And he did this by giving us the ultimate, quintessential fantasy protagonist, Eddard Ned Stark. Look at how Ned is framed through the first book. He is the Lord of Winterfell, carrying a legendary ancestral sword made of Valyrian steel. He is a loving father, a devoted husband, and a fiercely honorable man surrounded by a court of vipers. Out of the 73 chapters in the first novel, Ned is the point of view character for 15 of them, far more than anyone else. The camera of the narrative is firmly anchored behind his eyes. Martin structures Ned's storyline as a classic detective mystery. Ned is a righteous investigator trying to uncover the murder of the previous Hand of the King. He is uncovering the dark, incestuous secret of the Queen. We, the readers, are right there with him, putting the pieces together. We are conditioned by decades of consuming pop culture to believe that the detective must survive to reveal the truth and bring the villains to justice. We watch Ned make mistakes. We watch him foolishly warn Queen Cersei Lannister out of a misplaced sense of mercy. We watch him trust Pet- we watch him trust Peter Baelish, the Master of Coin, despite every red flag waving in his face. But even as the trap closes around him, our genre conditioning protects us from true panic. We think, yes, things look incredibly grim right now. But this is the main character. He is the moral compass of the story. Something will save him. We expect the Tolkienesque intervention. We expect his son, Robb Stark, to march down with a northern army and break the gate just in time. We expect Varys to smuggle him out of the dungeons through a secret tunnel. We expect King Joffrey to accept his false confession and send him to the wall to take the black. We expect the universe to bend. And then we arrive at the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor. The scene is a masterclass in psychological torture. Ned Stark, stripped of his honor, his leg shattered, leaning heavily on a cane, confesses to a treason he did not commit to save the lives of his daughters. The crowd screams for his blood. We are waiting for the Deus Ex Machina. We are waiting for the eagles. Instead, the boy king, Joffrey Baratheon, smiles capriciously and says, "Bring me his head." Even then, the reader is in denial. The executioner, Sir Ilan Payne, steps forward. He draws ice, Ned's own greatsword. The blade is raised. The point of view shifts abruptly to Arya Stark, his young daughter, watching from the crowd. We think someone will stop the blade, a hidden archer, a sudden riot, a magical intervention. But no one stops the blade. The sword comes down. The metal bites through flesh and bone, and the head of the main character, the moral anchor of the entire universe, rolls across the marble steps. The absolute, paralyzing shock of that moment cannot be overstated. When A Game of Thrones was first published in 1996, readers threw the book across the room. They felt physically sick. They felt betrayed. Because Martin had not just killed Ned Stark. He had taken the invisible sacred plot armor of the fantasy genre and decapitated it in a broad daylight. Why did Ned Stark die? He did not die because he was evil or because it served a grand poetic destiny. He died because he made a series of catastrophic tactical errors in a highly volatile political environment. He died because he brought a code of honor to a knife fight. This is the central thesis of Martin's storytelling architecture. Consequence is absolute, and destiny is a lie. In Martin's universe, the narrative operates on a system of Newtonian physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If you trust a known liar, you will be betrayed. If you threaten a ruthless queen without having the military power to back it up, you will be neutralized. Gravity does not care if you have a pure heart. If you step off a cliff, you will fall. By killing Ned Stark, Martin fundamentally rewrote the psychological contract with the reader. He injected a terrifying, exhilarating dose of reality into the fantasy genre. From that moment on, every single time a character we love is in danger, whether it is Tyrion Lannister standing trial, or Jon Snow surrounded by wildlings, or Daenerys Targaryen lost in the Dothraki Sea, our anxiety is real. Our fear is palpable, because we know with absolute certainty that the author is not afraid to pull the trigger. The safety net is gone. The eagles are not coming. This execution proved that Westeros is a world indifferent to morality. But this raises a profound structural question. If the universe does not inherently protect the good, does it inherently punish the wicked? If the chosen one trope is a lie, what happens to the concept of the Dark Lord? Do not close the ledger just yet. Throw another log on the fire, and let us turn our attention to the shadows. We must search the maps for Sauron, and we will discover the terrifying truth of why Martin refused to put him there. Unroll the heavy parchment across the oak surface of our desk. Bring the candle closer. I want you to trace your finger along the jagged coastlines of Westeros, from the freezing forests of the north, down through the fertile riverlands, all the way to the scorching deserts of Dorne. Look closely at the sigils of the great houses, the castles carved into mountain sides, and the sprawling cities choking on their own populations. As your cartographer, I am asking you to search this map for something very specific. I want you to find the epicenter of evil. I want you to pinpoint to the dark fortress where the ultimate cosmic villain sits upon a throne of skulls, plotting the destruction of all that is good and green in the world. Look hard. Search for the shivering wastes beyond the wall. Search the smoking ruins of Valeria across the narrow sea. Search the deep dungeons of the Red Keep. You will not find it. And that, more than any other architectural decision of Martin's universe, is most terrifying revelation of all. In this chapter, we must dismantle the most psychologically comforting illusion of the fantasy genre, the myth of the Dark Lord. We must understand how classic mythology externalized human cruelty, creating a singular, destroyable anomaly. And we must analyze how Martin dragged evil out of the cosmic void and planted it firmly back where it belongs, in the center of the human heart. To grasp the sheer narrative violence of George Martin's world building, we have to understand why the Dark Lord trope was created in the first place and why we, as readers, are so desperately addicted to it. In classic Tolkienesque fantasy, evil with a capital E is an externalized, almost geological force. It is an anomaly. Think of Sauron in his Dark Tower, Morgoth in Angband, or if we look beyond Middle-earth, Emperor Palpatine or Lord Voldemort. These entities are not just bad people. They are the physical embodiments of malice. They operate as a structural containment zone for all the cruelty, sadism, and destruction in their respective universes. In Middle-earth, if the crops are dying, if the weather is unnaturally cold, if the orcs are multiplying, it's because of the localized radiation of the Dark Lord's presence in Mordor. This trope provides the reader with an incredible, deep-seated psychological comfort. Why? Because it implies that the natural state of the world and the natural state of humanity is inherently good, peaceful, and harmonious. War, famine, and cruelty are not the fault of ordinary men. They are a sickness infected upon the world by an external virus. More importantly, the Dark Lord trope provides a singular, mechanical solution to the problem of evil. It creates a single point of failure. Because all the darkness in the world is tethered to one cosmic entity or one magical artifact, the heroes have a clear geopolitical objective. If you march to the volcano and drop the One Ring into the lava, the war instantly ends. The Dark Tower collapses. The ground swallows the enemy armies. The sky clears, the sun comes out, and the systemic corruption of the world is cured overnight. It is a beautiful mathematical equation. Eliminate the Dark Lord, and you eliminate evil itself. The moral parameters are cleanly drawn. You are either marching toward the light, or you have been corrupted by the dark. Now, look back at the map of Westeros. Where is the single point of failure? Where is the magic off switch? There isn't one. Martin absolutely refuses to give his readers the psychological comfort of externalized villain. When we search for a Dark Lord in A Song of Ice and Fire, the narrative gives us nothing but mirrors, reflecting our own historical ugliness back at us. You might argue that the White Walkers, the others, bringing the long night from the lands of always winter, are the Dark Lords of this universe. But look at how Martin utilizes them in the story. They are not a dark god orchestrating a grand, malicious plan from a volcanic throne room. For the vast majority of the narrative, they are a distant, almost abstract ecological threat. They are a force of nature, like a dooming ice age or a devastating plague. They do not dictate tax policy. They do not orchestrate political assassinations in King's Landing, and they do not force brothers to slaughter brothers in the Riverlands. The most horrific, traumatizing events in Westeros are not perpetrated by ice demons or cosmic gods of darkness. The atrocities are committed by the Lions of the Rock, by the Wolves of the North, by the Starks, the Krakens, and the Flayed Men. The true horrors are entirely, suffocatingly human. By removing the Dark Lord, Martin fundamentally changes the definition of evil in fantasy. In Westeros, evil is not an anomaly. It is not a magical virus. It is the default byproduct of human ambition, systemic inequality, and the ruthless machinery of feudalism. When you remove the central server of malice, evil becomes decentralized. It becomes pervasive, atmospheric, and impossible to defeat with a sword. Consider the War of the Five Kings. Who is the Dark Lord of this conflict? Is it Joffrey Baratheon? Joffrey is a vicious, sadistic sociopath, certainly, but he is a teenage boy, a pawn easily manipulated by his mother and his grandfather. He is not a master of dark magic. He is just a cruel child who was handled absolute, unchecked institutional power. Is the Dark Lord Tywin Lannister? Tywin orchestrates the slaughter of innocent children to secure his dynasty. He orders the extermination of entire bloodlines, but Tywin does not want to shroud the world in eternal darkness. He wants to ensure that the economic and political legacy of House Lannister survives the winter. His cruelty is terrifyingly precise because it is so utterly pragmatic, logical, and bureaucratic. What about Rose Bolton, who calmly drives a dagger into the heart of his liege lord at the wedding feast? Or Stannis Baratheon, who burns people alive at the stake because a priestess convinced him it was mathematically necessary to save the realm? None of these men wear black spiked armor. None of them sits on a thrones of fire. They sit in a comfortable pavilions, drinking arbor gold, writing letters, and making calculated decisions based on logistics, pride, and survival. This is what political philosopher Hannah Arendt famously called the banality of evil, and George Martin has masterfully woven this concept into the fabric of his fantasy world. Evil in Westeros is a ladder, as Peter Baelish would say. It is the daily, mundane choices made by men and women who convince themselves that the end justifies the means. It is the soldier who burns a farm because he was ordered to. It is the lord who starves a village to feed his army. It is the systemic, structural violence of society that treats the small folk as disposable currency in the Game of Thrones. This decentralization of evil creates a terrifying narrative reality. There is no win condition. If you take a Valyrian steel sword and cut off the head of Joffrey Baratheon, does the world suddenly becomes a better place? No. The systemic corruption remains. Another ruler simply steps into the vacuum and the machinery of oppression continues to grind. You cannot march an army to Casterly Rock or the Red Keep and destroy ambition. You cannot throw a magical artifact into a fire to cure humanity of its greed, its paranoia, and its lust for power. In classic fantasy, the hero's journey is focused on gathering the strength to defeat the monster. In Martin's world, The hero's journey is focused on trying to navigate a world made entirely of monsters without becoming one yourself. George Martin frequently cites a quote by the American novelist William Faulkner: "The human heart, in conflict with itself, is the only thing worth writing about." Martin took this philosophy and weaponized it against the fantasy genre. He realized that the Dark Lord trope was a crutch. It allowed authors to avoid the messy, complex reality of human morality by projecting all the bad traits onto a convenient, disposable monster. By killing the Dark Lord, Martin forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line dividing good and evil does not run between two opposite armies, or between the realms of men and dark wasteland. It runs straight through the center of every single character. Every lord, every knight, every peasant, and every king carries the capacity for profound grace and unimaginable cruelty. There is no Sauron in Westeros because Westeros does not need one. We are our own Dark Lords. We are the architects of our own destruction. And if the myth of the ultimate villain is a lie, then what about the myth of the ultimate destiny? In a world governed entirely by human choices, what happens to the ancient prophecies that supposedly guide the hands of kings? Let us keep the map unrolled and turn our attention to the illusions of the future. We must examine the treachery of foresight. Gaze into the heart of our study. Watch how the flames twist, shift, and consume the wood, casting long, erratic shadows against the stone walls. Since the dawn of human storytelling, mankind has harbored a desperate, primal obsession with the future. We want to know what the flames are whispering. We want to read the arrangement of the stars, decode the visions of the mystics, and uncover the grand design of our own lives. In the architecture of traditional fantasy literature, the desire is not only validated, it is structurally rewarded. In classic fantasy, prophecy is not a mere parlor trick or vague hallucination. It is an absolute, unbreakable law of narrative physics. When a seer in a traditional epic speaks of things to come, they are not guessing. They are reading the blueprints of the universe. Consider the ultimate benchmark of classical fantasy prophecy, the doom of the Witch King of Angmar in Tolkien's Legendarium. The elven lord Glorfindel makes a chilling, definitive prediction regarding the Lord of the Nazgul. Not by the hand of man will he fall. For centuries, this operates as a riddle, a poetic shield of invincibility. But when the battle on the Pelennor fields reaches its crescendo, the prophecy is fulfilled with a mathematical precision. A woman, Eowyn of Rohan, and the hobbit Meriadoc Brandybuck strike the fatal blows. The prophecy was not a lie. It was a literal, undeniable fact encoded into the fabric of Middle-earth. In Tolkien's world, destiny is a reliable architect. If the prophecy states that the king will return, the king will return. The universe will actively organize its pieces to ensure the fulfillment of the divine word. This creates a psychological safety net. It reassures the reader and the characters that history has a steering wheel and that someone benevolent is driving the carriage. But as we sit in the freezing currents of this new Machiavellian paradigm, we must discard that comfort. In the brutal, historical realism of George Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, prophecy is not a divine roadmap. It is a psychological poison. It is a hallucinogenic drug that drives man and woman to absolute madness, convincing them to burn their own lives to the ground in the vain pursuit of a mirage. Martin famously summarized his philosophy on foresight with a brilliant, cynical metaphor. He wrote, "Prophecy is like a half-trained mule. It looks as though it might be useful, but the moment you trust in it, it kicks you in the head." In Westeros, the future is not written in stone. It is a shifting, treacherous shadow. And the tragedy is not that the prophecies are entirely false. The tragedy is that they are self-fulfilling. The vision do not dictate the actions of the characters. Rather, the characters' paranoid, obsessive reactions to the visions create the exact doom they were desperately trying to avoid. To understand this catastrophic psychological trap, we must examine the Queen Regent, Cersei Lannister. Cersei's entire worldview, her paralyzing paranoia, and her ultimate political self-destruction are not born from a rational assessment of her enemies. They are born from a visit to the witch's tent in the woods of Lannisport when she was just a child. Maggie the Frog tasted a drop of Cersei's blood and delivered a terrifying, multi-layered curse. She prophesied that Cersei would marry the king, but he would have dozens of children while she would have only three. She prophesied that gold would be their crown and gold their shroud. She predicted that another, younger, and more beautiful queen would cast her down and take all she held dear. And finally, she stated that the Valanqua, the High Valyrian word for little brother, would wrap his hands about her pale, wild throat and choke the life from her. If this were a traditional fantasy, this prophecy would simply be a spoiler for the end of the book. But in Martin's hands, this prophecy is a cognitive virus. Cersei Lannister spends her entire adult life running from the shadows of Maggie's world, and in doing so, she arms the trap herself. Because she believes Tyrion, her dwarven little brother, is the Valanquar, she treats him with unimaginable cruelty, actively creating a bitter, hyper-intelligent enemy who ultimately murders their father and shatters the Lannister power structure. Because she believes Margaery Tyrell is the younger and more beautiful queen, Cersei orchestrates a disastrous, paranoid plot to destroy her, voluntarily handing military and judicial power to a group of religious zealots. This catastrophic political blunder leads directly to Cersei's own imprisonment, her Walk of Atonement, and the collapse of the Crown's authority. The prophecy did not destroy Cersei. Cersei destroyed Cersei. The vision of the future was merely the psychological catalyst that unlocked her own worst, most self-destructive traits. She looked into the flames, saw her own death, and sprinted directly toward it, believing she was running away. But if Cersei represents the paranoid, defensive reaction to prophecy, we must turn our gaze to a tragedy of a far greater scale. We must look at the offensive, idealistic obsession with destiny. We must look at the Silver Prince, Rhaegar Targaryen. In the lore of Westeros, Rhaegar is often mythologized as the perfect, melancholic hero. He was brilliant, beautiful, and loved by the small folk. He was exactly the kind of character who would serve as the ultimate victorious protagonist in any other fantasy series. But Rhaegar carried a fatal flaw. He was a scholar who read too many ancient scrolls. Rhaegar discovered the ancient Valyrian prophecy of the prince that was promised, a messianic figure born of smoke and salt who'd awaken dragons out of stone and sing the song of ice and fire to defeat the coming darkness. At first, Rhaegar believed he was the savior. Later, He became utterly convinced that the prophecy referred to his bloodline, and specifically to his children. He concluded that the dragon must have three heads. He already had two children with his wife, Elia Martell, but she was left barren and fragile after the second birth. Rhaegar's mathematical prophetic equation was incomplete. He needed a third head for the dragon. He needed a third child to fulfill a dusty, ancient text. Because of this profound, obsessive belief in a magical destiny, Rhaegar Targaryen bypassed every rule of feudal politics, duty, and diplomacy. He bypassed the logic of the statecraft to purse Lyanna Stark. Whether it was an abduction or a willing elopement, it is irrelevant to the geopolitical reality. His actions, driven purely by the pursuit of a prophecy, ignited Robert's rebellion. Rhaegar did not save the world, he doomed his family, because he trusted in the half-trained mule of prophecy. The trident ran red with blood. The Targaryen dynasty was violently overthrown. His innocent children from Elia were brutally murdered by Lannister soldiers, and his entire house was pushed to the absolute brink of extinction. The pursuit of destiny caused the continental apocalypse. This is the brilliant, devastating reality of Martin's storytelling. By making prophecy treacherous, subjective, and psychologically toxic, Martin strips away the comforting excuse of divine will. In Westeros, characters cannot blame the gods, and they cannot hide behind the veil of destiny. They must own their choices. Prophecy is not a map of the future, it is a mirror reflecting the deepest, darkest ambitions and fears of the person looking into it. When a character believes they are the chosen one, they grant themselves permission to commit unspeakable atrocities, convinced that the moral calculus of the universe will forgive them because their endgame is divine. When a character believes they are doomed, they commit unspeakable atrocities out of pure, desperate self-preservation. In the architecture of Ice and Fire, there is no sacred timeline. They are only human beings armed with dangerous, incomplete information, making flawed, emotional decisions in a world that does not care about their myth. Destiny is the greatest lie we tell ourselves to avoid the terrifying burden of free will. Smooth out the wrinkled parchment of the map before us. Press your hands against the curved edges and look closely at the center of the continent. Look at the Riverlands. In a traditional fantasy epic, a map is a board for a glorious game of chess. We move the pristine, noble pieces of our heroes across the painted forests and rivers, marching them toward a climatic, sanitized confrontation with the forces of darkness. We track the banners of the righteous as they ride to meet the monstrous horde. But George Martin does not allow us to view the map from the high, detached balconies of our royal palace. He forces our gaze down. He drags the narrative camera away from the shining armor of the High Lords and buries its face first into the cold, dysentery-soaked mud of the riverbanks. In this chapter, we must examine how A Song of Ice and Fire violently strips the genre of its martial heroism. We must confront the horrifying, unromantic reality of feudal warfare, and we must understand the profound architectural shift that occurs when an author decides to entirely remove the concept of the orc from the battlefield. To fully appreciate the brutality of Martin's world, we must first acknowledge the incredible narrative convenience of the monsters we left behind. In classic fantasy, the author faces a difficult moral dilemma. How do you allow your pure, heroic protagonists to engage in a mass slaughter without compromising their inherent goodness? How do you write thrilling, action-packed battle sequences without turning your knights into a traumatized butchers? Tolkien and the thousands of authors who followed in his footsteps solved this problem by creating a biologically and spiritually irredeemable enemy. They created the orc. The orc is a masterpiece of narrative utility. It is a creature devoid of humanity, devoid of a complex inner life, and devoid of innocence. Orcs do not have grieving mothers waiting for them at home. They do not have terrified children. They do not have dreams of peaceful harvest. They are the physical manifestation of malice, born from dark magic and bred solely for destruction. Therefore, when the hero swings his glowing sword and decapitates three orcs in a single motion, the reader feels no empathy for the fallen. We feel only triumph. The violence is morally sterilized. War becomes a clean, guilt-free crusade. The slaughter of the enemy is not a tragic loss of life. It is a necessary, righteous sanitation of the world. This trope allows the fantasy genre to sing glorious songs of war, to celebrate the clash of steel, and to maintain the illusion that violence can be fundamentally beautiful, as long as it is direct at the right target. George Martin takes this sterilized, guilt-free mechanism and burns it to the ground. In Westeros, there are no orcs. There are no faceless, irredeemable hordes of pure evil waiting to be righteously slaughtered. When the lords of the Seven Kingdoms play their Game of Thrones, when they declare war over wounded pride, broken betrothals, or kidnapped sisters, they do not summon magical creatures from the depths of the earth. They summon the small folk. The armies of Westeros are not composed of professional, heroic warriors. They are composed of illiterate farmers, terrified cobblers, teenage stable boys, and aging fishermen. When Robb Stark marches south to avenge his father, or when Tywin Lannister burns the Riverlands to secure his dynasty, the people dying in the mud are not monsters. They are human beings who could not care less about who sits on the Iron Throne. They are peasants who are handed a rusted spear, pulled away from the crying wives, and forced to march into a meat grinder because a high lord they have never met ordered them to do so. By removing the moral shield of the orc, Martin forces the reader to endure the psychological weight of every single casualty. When a knight in Westeros charges through an infantry line, smashing skulls with a mace, we are not cheering for a righteous victory. We are watching a privileged, heavily armored aristocrat butcher starving, terrified peasants who are only there because they were forced into conscription. The heroism of the battlefield evaporates, replaced by a nausing, suffocating sense of tragedy. To distill this anti-war philosophy into its purest, most devastating form, Martin poses his sprawling political narrative in the fourth book. A Fist for Crows, to deliver one of the most profound monologues in the history of modern fantasy. He gives the stage to a wandering, barefoot priest named Septon Meribald, who explains the life cycle of the common soldier. He explains the creation of the broken man. I want you to listen to the echoes of Meribald's sermon in this quiet study. It is not a tale of heroic destiny. It is an autopsy of the human soul under the crushing weight of war. Meribald explains that the tragedy begins with an illusion. When the local lord calls his banners, the young peasant boy march off with a song in their hearts. They have been fed the same romantic lies that the fantasy genre feeds its readers. They dream of glory, of saving a princess, of returning home with a bag of silver and a chest full of medals. They march with their brothers, their fathers, and their friends, believing that war is an adventure. And then the reality of the logistics sets in. Before they even see the enemy, the adventure rots. Their cheap, poorly made shoes fell, fell apart on the long march, leaving their feet blistered and bleeding. Their rations run out, leaving them starving and foraging for scraps. They begin to suffer from dysentery, sleeping in the freezing rain, coughing up blood before they have even drawn their swords. Then come the first battle. Maribald describes the sheer, paralyzing sensory overload of medieval combat. The deafening roar of the war horns, the storm of arrows blotting out the sun, the terrifying, ground-shaking thunder of heavily armored cavalry crashing into a line of unarmored men holding wooden pikes. In an instant, the peasant boy is covered in the blood of the man standing next to him. He watches his brother get trampled by a destrier. He watches his father's head caved in by a mace. He survives the battle, only to be marched to the next one, and the next, and the next. He is transferred from lord to lord, fighting for banners he does not recognize, killing a man who speaks his exact same language. Eventually, the human mind simply collapses. The boy breaks. He drops his shield, he drops his spear, and he runs into the wood. He does not run out of cowardice. He runs because the cognitive machinery of his brain has been completely shattered by trauma. He becomes a broken man. He hides in the forest, starving, hunted by the very lords who conscripted him. He strips the boots of the corpses of his fallen friends just to survive the winter. He steals a chicken from a farmhouse. When the farmer tries to stop him, the broken man kills him. The tragic victim of the war has seamlessly, horrifyingly transformed into the perpetrator. He becomes a bandit, a monster in the dark, not because he was born evil, not because he serves a dark lord, but because the systemic, ruthless machinery of feudal warfare ground his humanity into dust. This is the ultimate deconstruction of the fantasy war epic. In the high halls of the Red Keep, the minstrels sing beautiful songs of valor. They sing of the brave knights, the shimmering armor, and the glorious charges. But Martin insists that the songs are a lie, constructed by the elite to justify their own ambition. Down in the mud, there is no music. There is only the agonizing wail of the wounded, begging for water. There are only crows descending upon the fields to feast on the eyes of the fallen, indifferent to whether the corpse were the lion of Lannister or the dire wolf of Stark. Martin has achieved something mathematically brilliant here. He has taken the epic scale of high fantasy and injected it with the grueling, miserable realism of a World War I trench. He has proven that you do not need dark magic to create a wasteland. You do not need a volcano spewing ash to destroy a continent. All you need is a handful of proud, ambitious men willing to sacrifice the lives of the innocents for a slightly more comfortable chair in the capital. The chasm between the illusion of the noble knight and the reality of the butcher is vast. But how does this illusion sustain itself? How do the highborn lords convince themselves that they are the heroes of the story, even as they wade through the blood of the smallpox? Do not extinguish the candle just yet. We must turn our attention away from the peasants in the mud and look up the shining white cloaks of the King's Guard. We must dissect the greatest hypocrisy of Westeros. We must examine the lie of the true knight. Turn your eyes away from the blood-soaked mud of the Riverlands. Leave the broken man in the forests, and let us travel south, down the King's Road, until the massive, red brick walls of the capital rise before us. Step into the Red Keep to listen to the music of the lutes echoing through the vaulted halls. Smell the lemon cakes, the arbor gold, and the sweet perfume of the highborn ladies. We have left the horrifying reality of the battlefield, but do not let the velvet and the silk deceive you. The violence here is just as absolute. It is merely wearing a prettier mask. In this chapter, we must take our scalpel to one of the oldest, most romanticized foundations of the entire fantasy genre. We must deconstruct the Arthurian myth. We must examine the institution of chivalry and witness how George Martin methodically, ruthlessly murders the illusion of the true knight in shimmering armor. To understand the sheer violence of this deconstruction, we must first acknowledge how deeply we, the readers, have been culturally conditioned by the songs. From the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, to the Rangers of the North and the Riders of Rohan, the fantasy genre has always presented the knight as the ultimate paragon of virtue. In the traditional mythos, the armor is not just a defensive tool made of steel. It is a physical manifestation of the wearer's moral purity. The knight is the sworn defender of the weak, the protector of the innocent, and the champion of women. His vows are sacred. His white cloak is a symbol of untarnished soul. When a young girl in a classic fairy tale is trapped in a tower or cornered by monsters, she only needs to wait for the knight to arrive. He will strike down the wicked, offer her his hand, and the world will be set right. When we open A Game of Thrones, George Martin knows exactly what we are expecting, and so he gives us a proxy. He creates a character whose entire worldview is built upon the exact same romantic tropes that govern our own expectations of the genre. He gives us Sansa Stark. Sansa is not merely a naive child. She is the living embodiment of the traditional fantasy reader. She has memorized the songs of Florian and John Quill. She believes in the absolute inherent goodness of beautiful people and the inherent wickedness of the ugly. She believes that a prince is always noble and a knight is always true. Her journey throughout the narrative is not just a character arc, it is a brutal, agonizing education. Through Sansa's eyes, Martin takes the romantic poetry of the genre and crushes it against the cold, unfeeling stone of reality. The first great crack in the porcelain facade occurs during the Hand's tourney. In a traditional fantasy story, a tournament is a place of glory, where the righteous hero proves his worth before a cheering crowd. Sansa watches the jousting with stars in her eyes, mesmerized by the painted shields, the fluttering banners, and the gleaming armor. It is a fairy tale brought to life. But Martin immediately subverts the theater. He shows us the gruesome, unromantic mechanics of the violence underneath the pageantry. During a tilt, a young, newly made knight named Sir Hugh of the Vale is struck in the throat by the massive, hulking Sir Gregor Clegane. This is not a clean, cinematic death. Sir Hugh falls from his horse, his throat torn open by a jagged splinter of a tourney lance. He lies in the dirt, drowning in his own blood, convulsing in agony as the crimson stains the pristine sands of the list. And what is the reaction of the noble court? There is a brief moment of shock, and then the tournament simply continues. The body is dragged away, the sand is raked over the blood, and the High Lords go back to eating their roasted meats and clapping for the next rider. In that moment, Martin strips away the illusion. The tourney is not a celebration of honor, it is a grotesque, institutionalized blood sport where the wealthy elite entertain themselves with the deaths of lesser men. The shining armor is just metal, and the men inside it are entirely capable of murder in broad daylight, fully protected by the applause of the king. If the tourney is the theatrical stage of the life, the Kingsguard is its breathing heart. In the lore of Westeros, The King's Guard is the pinnacle of chivalry. 7 knights, chosen for their unparalleled skills and absolute purity, clad in scales of pure white enamel, wearing white cloaks that signify their immaculate devotion. They swear vows for forsake all lands, titles, and wives, living only to protect the king and defend the innocent. But let us look at the men who actually wear the white cloaks during the reign of Geoffrey Baratheon. We have Sir Mervyn Trant and Sir Boros Blount. When King Joffrey becomes enraged by the military victories of Robb Stark in the north, he decides to punish Sansa. He orders his King's Guard to beat a defenseless, terrified teenage girl in the middle of the throne room. What happens to the sacred vows of chivalry? What happens to the solemn oath to protect the innocents and defend the weak? Sir Meryn Trant does not hesitate. He draws his mailed fist and strikes Sansa across the face, splitting her lip and leaving her bruised and bleeding. He does it not because he's a cosmic Dark Lord, but simply because he's a coward following orders. He hides his sadism behind the shield of his vows, arguing that his oath to obey the king supersedes the oath to protect the weak. This is Martin's surgical critique of institutionalized morality. In Westeros, knighthood is a political construct. It is a public relations campaign designed by feudal warlords to give a divine, moral mandate to state-sanctioned violence. The white cloak does not change the nature of the man wearing it. It merely provides him with legal immunity. As the Kingslayer himself, Jaime Lannister bitterly observes the vows of knighthood are inherently contradictory. Obey the knight, keep his secrets, do his bidding, protect the innocents, defend the weak. But what do you do when the king is a madman who wants to burn the innocent? No matter what you choose, you are breaking a vow. The institution is rigged. It is designed to fail. To provide the ultimate counterweight to the hypocrisy of the true knight, Martin creates one of the most compelling and psychologically complex characters in modern literature. Sandor Clegane, the Hound. Sandor is the visual and thematic antithesis of the fairy tale prince. Half of his face is a melted, grotesque mask of scar tissue, a physical reminder of the cruelty of his older brother, the anointed knight, Sir Gregor. Sandor refuses to take the vows of knighthood. He refuses the title of Sir. He despises the institution with a burning, cynical passion because he knows exactly what hides behind the white cloaks. He knew that the man who held his face in a brazier of burning coals was knighted by a prince with a Valyrian steel sword. Martin uses the Hound to completely shatter Sansa's worldview. During the Battle of Blackwater, as the city burns in green wildfire and the illusion of safety collapses, Sandor corners Sansa in her bedchamber. He does not offer her poetry. He offers her the horrifying, unvarnished truth of the world she lives in. He tells her, "There are no true knights, no more than there are gods. If you can't protect yourself, die and get out of the ways who can. Sharp steel and strong arms rule this world. Don't ever believe any different." He forces her to look at him, to look at the reality of violence, stripped of its songs and banners. He says, "I am a dog, and a dog will die for you, but never lie to you." This dynamic is the philosophical core of Martin's Deconstruction. The true knights, like Meryn Trant, smile at Sansa, call her "my lady," and then beat her until she bleeds. Sandor Clegane curses at her, mocks her songs, threatens her, and yet he is the only person in the entire capital who consistently protects her. He saves her from a riot. He refuses to beat her when ordered, and he offers to take her away from the burning city. In the moral calculus of George Martin, the honest butcher is infinitely superior to the hypocritical knight. Sandor accepts that he is a killer. He embraces the ugliness of his profession. By refusing the cloak and the vows, he refuses to lie to himself and the world about what he is. Turn your back to the drafting desk and walk with me toward towering oak bookshelves that line the deepest, darkest corners of our study. Look at the heavy volumes resting on the wooden shelves. If we are to truly understand the architectural revolution that Martin unleashed upon the fantasy genre, we cannot merely look at the characters or the plot lines. We must look at the foundation stones. We must examine the mortar that holds the bricks together. We must understand where the creator of the universe went to find his blueprints. To comprehend the shift, we must briefly look at the books Tolkien used to build Middle-earth. Tolkien was first and foremost a philologist and a scholar of ancient myth. When he laid the foundation for his legendarium, he reached for the highest, most revered text of human civilization. He reached for the Beowulf epic. He reached for the Norse poetic Edda, the Finnish Kalevala, and the deepest, most profound theology of the Catholic Bible. Because of this foundational text, Middle-earth operates as an epos, a grand mythological poem. The world is a fallen Eden, and the trajectory of the story is defined by a cosmic, spiritual struggle between the divine forces of creation and the nihilistic forces of destruction. The characters are grand archetypes. The language is elevated, archaic, and poetic. When a king speaks in Tolkien's world, he speaks with the resonance of an ancient prophet. When a sword is forged, it is imbued with starlight and destiny. Tolkien was attempting to write a lost mythology for England, a prehistoric epoch of our own world where the moral boundaries were absolute and the hand of providence guided by the fate of the righteous. It is beautiful, it is sublime, but is fundamentally a fairy tale operating on the logic of angels and demons. Martin did not go by the mythic poems to build Westeros. He bypassed the legends of King Arthur and the songs of Roland. Instead, he went to the dusty, unsanitized, and horrifyingly mundane records of the historical chroniclers. He went to the tax rolls, the trial transcripts, the battlefield logistic reports, and the dynastic genealogies of medieval Europe. Martin's foundational texts were not about gods fighting over magical jewels. His foundational texts were about cousins butchering each other over a strip of a fertile land. The primary, undeniable skeleton of A Song of Ice and Fire is The Wars of the Roses, a series of brutal, exhausting, and incredibly complex civil wars fought in the 15th century for control of the throne of England. In real history, the conflict was waged between two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Look at the linguistic and thematic translation. Lancaster and York, Lannister and Stark. Martin took the map of England, inverted it, enlarged it to the size of South America, and populated it with the ghosts of real history. The Wars of the Roses, there was no Dark Lord. There was no cosmic evil threatening to swallow the world in eternal night. There was only a power vacuum created by an incompetent king, which led to a ruthless, multi-generational slaughter as various lords and ladies used marriage, assassination, and military force to secure their own bloodlines. By anchoring his fantasy world in the Wars of the Roses, Martin instantly grounded the narrative in gritty, unromantic realism. The conflict in Westeros is not about saving humanity. It is about taxation, land ownership, trade routes, and personal pride. It is a dynastic squabble where the combatants are not elves and orcs, but flawed, desperate human beings who are fully convinced that God is on their side. When Martin needs a shocking plot twist, he does not invent a magical curse. He simply opens a history book and borrows the worst atrocities that mankind has already committed. Consider the most infamous, traumatizing sequence in modern fantasy literature: the Red Wedding, the massacre of Robb Stark, his mother, and his bannerman under the sacred roof of the twins, shattered millions of readers. It felt like a cruel, unprecedented violation of the rules of fiction. But Martin did not invent the horror of the Red Wedding. He merely adapted it from the blood-soaked history of Scotland. Martin combined two real historical atrocities to forge the Red Wedding. The first was the Black Dinner of 1440, where the young Earl of Douglas was invited to dine with the King of Scotland. After a feast of apparent friendship, a black bull's head, the symbol of death, was suddenly dropped onto the table. The Earl was dragged into the courtyard and executed, despite the sacred laws of hospitality. The second inspiration was the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, where members of the MacDonald clan were slaughtered in their sleep by their own guests, soldiers of the Campbell clan who had been sharing their food and their fire for nearly 2 weeks. In real medieval history, guest right was not a fairy tale concept. It was a desperate, necessary law of survival in a hostile world. If you could not trust that you wouldn't be murdered while eating another man's bread, then all diplomacy, travel, and society would collapse. When Walder Frey violates this law at the Red Wedding, the shock we feel is not a fantasy shock. It is the visceral ancestral terror of a real-world taboo being broken. Martin proves that you do not need a dark wizard to create absolute terror. You only need the capacity for human betrayal. This historical grounding extends to the very institutions that govern Westeros. In Tolkien's world, religion is invisible. It is a quiet, spiritual reverence woven into the fabric of the universe. There are no churches, no popes, and no holy inquisitions in Middle-earth. But in Westeros, religion is a sprawling, political, and deeply corrupt institution, directly mirroring the medieval Catholic Church. The faith of the Seven has a pope, the High Septon. It has cardinals, monks, and cathedrals. And when Cersei Lannister decides to arm the faith militant, Martin is drawing a direct, terrifying parallel to the rise of the religious extremism, the Crusades, and the brutal fanatism of the Spanish Inquisition. We can see the echoes of the historical trials of the Knights Templar in the way political factions in King's Landing use religious cults, accusations of heresy, and sexual deviance to destroy their political rivals. Faith is not a pathway to spiritual enlightenment. It is a weapon. It is a it is a cudgel used by the powerful to control the masses, and occasionally a fire that burns out of control and consumes the very people who ignited it. So, what about the magic? What about the giant ice wall in the north? What about the dragons? They are present, of course, but look at how they are utilized. The wall is not a magical barrier of myth. It is a direct, scaled-up historical parallel to Hadrian's Wall, built by Romans to keep the barbarians out of civilized territory. And the dragons? And classic mythology. A dragon is a sentient creature of greed, like Smaug, hoarding gold in a mountain, representing the sin of avarice. In Martin's historical paradigm, dragons are completely devoid of moral symbolism. They are simply animals, highly destructive, incredibly dangerous animals that operate as weapons of mass destruction. When Aegon the Conqueror arrived in Westeros with 3 dragons, he did not fight a mythic battle between good and evil. He utilized an overwhelming, asymmetric military advantage to force a divided continent into submission. The Targaryen dragons are the narrative equivalent of the nuclear bomb, or in a more medieval context, They are the Norman cavalry charging through the Anglo-Saxon shield walls at the Battle of Hastings. They are the technological and military absolute. This is the ultimate genius of Martin. By building the 90% of his world out of hard geopolitical and historical reality, he ensures that the 10% of fantasy finally intrudes. When a shadow assassin is born, or when a dragon breathes fire, the impact is utterly devastating. We believe in the dragons precisely because we believe in tax policies, the dynastic marriages, and the mud on the boots of the infantrymen. We are not reading a myth, we are reading an alternate history. But as we survive the ruins of the fantasy tropes we have just dismantled, we must ask ourselves one final question. If this world is so brutal, so cynical, and so devoid of traditional heroism, why do we love it so much? Why are we drawn to the freezing cold of the north and the treacherous halls of the Red Keep? Look at the heavy, iron-bound ledger resting in the center of our desk. The pages we have turned tonight are not filled with the elegant, flowing, elvish script of a forgotten golden age. They are stained with the suits of burning castles, the ink of forged letters, and the dried blood of men who trusted the wrong smiles. Run your hand across the rough parchment of the Westerosi map. You can almost feel the jagged edges of the mountains and the freezing, unforgiving expanse of the north. We have spent hours in the shadows of this study, systematically dismantling the towering, beautiful architecture of traditional fantasy. We have taken a hammer to the divine right of the kings. We have executed the chosen one. We have banished the cosmic Dark Lord, and we have exposed the chivalric knight as a hollow, violent hypocrite. As we reach to the end of this first monumental expedition into the world of George Martin, a profound and necessary question remains hanging in the freezing air of our archive. If A Song of Ice and Fire is so utterly devoid of traditional comforts, if it is so cynical, brutal, and relentlessly tragic, why do we care? Why did this specific story captivate the entire globe, fundamentally rewriting the rules of modern pop culture? To answer that, we must understand the true purpose behind Martin's literary violence. He did not deconstruct the fantasy genre out of hatred for it. He did it out of a deep, desperate love and a desire to elevate it from a stagnant pond of predictable fairy tales into a mirror capable of reflecting the raw, terrifying complexity of the human condition. For decades, following the monumental success of Tolkien, the fantasy genre had fallen into a comfortable, deeply predictable slumber. The bookshelves were overflowing with pale imitations of Middle-earth. You know the formula perfectly. A young, humble farm boy discovers he is the secret heir to a magical throne. He finds a glowing sword. He gathers a diverse fellowship of inherently good companions. They embark on a linear quest to defeat a dark wizard dressed in black, who lives in a wasteland in the east. Along the way, the farm boy discovers his inner courage. The prophecy is fulfilled. The Dark Lord is vanquished, and the farm boy becomes a wise and just king. It was a beautiful formula. It had been an anesthetic. It numbed the reader. When you know exactly how the equation will be solved before you even turn the first page, the stakes evaporate. The emotional investment becomes shallow. We read those books not to explore the unknown, but to be comforted by the familiar. George Martin looked at this landscape of endless, safe trilogies and decided to introduce the one element that traditional fantasy had always kept safely locked outside the castle gates: gravity. He brought the genre crashing down to earth by introducing the brutal, historical laws of physics, logistics, taxation, infection, betrayal, and consequence. He shattered the anesthetic glass. When Ned Stark's head rolled across the steps of the great sept of Baelor, It was not just the death of a character, it was a violent, necessary awakening for the reader. Martin grabbed us by the collar and said, "Pay attention. The safety net is gone. The eagles are not coming to save you. Every choice matters, and every mistake is paid for in blood." This injection of hyperrealism did something miraculous. By making the world darker, Martin paradoxically made the light infinitely more valuable. Think about the concept of heroism in a traditional fantasy world. When the universe is fundamentally moral, when the gods are watching over you, and when you doing the right thing practically guarantees you ultimate victory. Being a hero is easy. It is the default setting. But in the suffocating, morally bankrupt mad of Westeros, doing the right thing is the most dangerous, terrifying choice a human being can make. When the world rewards cruelty, paranoia, and betrayal, a genuine act of kindness becomes a profound, almost suicidal act of rebellion. When there is no magical providence to protect you, standing between a helpless child and a man with a sword requires a level of courage that classic fantasy heroes never actually had to master. This is the brilliant, agonizing synthesis of A Song of Ice and Fire. We do not read these books because we enjoy watching people suffer. We read them because the suffering validates the survival. We read them because in a world populated by the Machiavellian ruthlessness of Tywin Lannister and the sadistic cruelty of Ramsay Bolton, the stubborn, battered honor of a character like Brienne of Tarth shines with a blinding, desperate brilliance. When Brienne swears an oath to protect someone, we know she does not have plot armor. We know she could be mutilated or killed in the very next chapter. And because we know that, her choice to draw her sword anyway carries a physical, emotional weight that 1,000 invincible chosen one protagonists could never achieve. Martin stripped away the gods, the prophecies, and the magical shields, leaving his characters entirely naked before the storm. He proved that you do not need to rely on the external mechanics of magic to create epic drama. The most terrifying monsters do not live in the lands of always winter. They live in our own ambitions. The most complex labyrinths are not ancient, cursed dungeons. They are the shifting loyalties of the human heart. By making the fantasy real, he made it matter. The winter of realism has fallen over the genre, and nothing will ever be the same again. The fairy tale is officially over. The comfortable illusions of our childhood have been burned away, leaving only the cold, hard ash of consequence. It is time to close the ledger for tonight. The candles in our study are burning dangerously low, pouring wax upon the heavy oak of our desk. We have successfully mapped the outer boundaries of this new, terrifying paradigm. We have dismantled the foundations of the old world. But our true work has only just begun. Now that we know the rules of this new game, now that we know that plot armor does not exist, that destiny is a lie, and that good, honorable kings are always first to die, we must prepare ourselves for a much darker descent. When we meet next time in the study, we will not remain on the surface. We will leave the battlefields and the tourney grounds behind. We will take a torch, open the iron rod doors, and walk down into the suffocating, windowless dungeons of the Red Keep. We are going to examine the architects of the shadows. We are going to look into the eyes of the spider and the mockingbird. We are going to dissect the true, terrifying physics of power. Rest well. Keep the fire burning. The Game of Thrones has begun.